This video is about the work ethic, and it focuses on two of the main principles of populist conservatism. The first is the importance of social norms, like a strong work ethic, as compared to economic incentives or central planning. And the second is the importance of bottom-up processes versus top-down processes. Leftists prefer top-down processes. You want to put the experts in charge and have them make all the decisions. And you see that most clearly in communism, where you have central planners in Moscow running the entire economy for the entire nation. Capitalism instead delivers the decision-making authority to individual agents at the bottom, and it ends up being far more efficient because it does that. And that same principle will apply to firms, as we'll see in this video and the next one. So here's a joke about management. So once upon a time, a guy named Smith was hired as CEO of a company. And on his first day on the job, he found 3 sealed and numbered envelopes in the drawer of his desk, along with a note that said, "When you get into trouble, open one of these envelopes." So Smith closed the drawer and he forgot all about them until he had a particularly bad quarterly earnings report. Then he remembered the envelopes and opened the one labeled number 1. Inside was a short note that said, "Blame your predecessor." So Smith held a press conference and blamed his predecessor, and it worked. The firm's stock price recovered, and the board of directors got off his back. A year later, Smith had another bad quarter, so he opened envelope number 2. And this note said, "Announce a reorganization." So Smith held another press conference and announced a major reorganization, and once again the press conference worked and the firm's stock price recovered, and the board got off his back for a little while. And then a third year passed and he had yet another bad quarter, so he went to the final envelope. Inside the note read, "Prepare 3 envelopes." Modern employees intuitively understand the lesson of that joke. Leave your job before you open that third envelope. But it didn't always work that way. Once upon a time, the prevailing theory of management was long-term excellence, and that was really the school of thought during the boom years after World War II. And these days we tend to think about it as though it's a relic of an uncompetitive past in which firms gave people lifetime jobs like an act of charity. But long-term employment creates long-term accountability. And these days, just like the joke suggests, employees have an internal clock that tells them how long they have before any failures are blamed on them and not their predecessors. And when they feel like that clock's starting to run out, they find a new job and start the clock all over again. But when they find the new job, a lot of institutional knowledge walks out the door with them. 2 major events changed the long-term excellence theory of management. The first was the rise of libertarian economics in the 1980s, spearheaded by Milton Friedman. He wrote a famous article in the New York Times called "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." And the point is exactly what the title suggests. Firms have one and only one responsibility, and that's to generate profits. Now, Friedman was arguing against the idea that firms might voluntarily cut pollution to help the environment or to lower prices in order to fight inflation. He did not really focus on internal stakeholders such as workers, but the lesson was clear. Workers had become these replaceable and fungible quantities, and firms could scale up or scale down or replace workers at will, precisely because they were replaceable commodities. The second major change was when Jack Welch became CEO of General Electric. Now, GE was founded by Thomas Edison, who invented the light bulb, and the list of products that GE invented would take a whole video just to enumerate them properly. But some of them include the diesel locomotive, the jet engine, and the refrigerator. But that all changed when Jack Welch became head of GE. Welch invented a management practice known as stack rank, in which all employees were ranked and the bottom 10% were fired, year after year, every single year. Steve Ballmer adapted stack rank for Microsoft, and it almost ruined the company, and today Ballmer is remembered for being one of the worst CEOs in tech history. Marissa Mayer adopted stack rank for Yahoo, and it almost ruined that company too, and she's also known as being one of the worst CEOs in tech history. If you want to ruin your workplace culture, implement stack rank. But Welch seemed to have better luck. He was CEO for 20 years, and GE met its earnings forecast all 80 quarters of his tenure. But GE's success was built on a house of cards that could not last. Under Welch's tenure, GE did not invent any new or innovative products, and instead they grew by acquisitions. Welch turned GE Capital, which was created to help consumers finance their first refrigerator, into what was essentially an unlicensed bank. And then using financial shell games and income smoothing and creative earnings management, GE could meet its quarterly earnings targets. The investors themselves did not know to what extent GE Capital was involved, and even Jeffrey Immelt, Welch's handpicked successor, did not know how vulnerable GE Capital had become. And it turns out that Welch benefited from some extremely good timing because he retired 2 days before 9/11. As his successor Immelt put it, "My second day as chairman, a plane I lease, flying with engines I built, crashed into a building that I insure and was covered by a network I own." So the crash revealed the extent of GE Capital's exposure, but the real turning point happened a year later when Enron's accounting fraud came to light. In response, the government passed Sarbanes-Oxley, which led to increased oversight of accounting and financial dealings, and this would have made Welch's playbook difficult or even impossible to execute. And the final blow came with the housing bubble crash in 2008 because GE Capital had bet heavily on subprime mortgages. Eventually, the company was split into 3 pieces, and the greatest firm in U.S. history had essentially ceased to exist. The brand name lives on because brand names of failed firms always have value, but the firm itself, as it was originally built, no longer exists. Yet, Welch was lionized by the press and was widely considered to be the best CEO of the century. His management style became the standard way to run a business. The idea that American businesses only look to the next quarter, that came from Welch. The idea that people should not expect to have a long-term career at a company, also Welch. That workers are disposable commodities, Welch. That certain metrics, such as the return on net assets, have a magical ability to measure the value of a firm, once again, Welch. So here's a good way to think about firms, which is that they have 2 bank accounts. The first bank account is short-term performance, and the second bank account is long-term excellence. The short-term bank account is all public information. Anyone can look up a firm's stock price, quarterly earnings, or calculate metrics like the return on net assets. But the long-term excellence account is private information. It consists of things that are impossible to objectively measure, like worker quality, worker morale, institutional knowledge, workplace culture and norms of effort, efficiency of the business processes, and technical debt. So people who work in the core business usually have a accurate subjective feel of the status of the long-term excellence bank account, but you can't actually measure it objectively. And so this is once again the problem of private information that was covered in Populist Conservatism number 9. You can divide firms into peaches or lemons. Peaches are firms with a healthy long-term excellence bank account, and lemons are firms with an unhealthy, depleted long-term excellence bank account. So the core workers in the core business, they have a good subjective feel for that bank account, but no one else does. Some more libertarian-minded viewers may be disagreeing, so let's talk about the efficient markets hypothesis. It comes in both a strong form and a weak form. The strong form is that the stock market price reflects all the information about a firm, both public and private. So in other words, both the short-term performance and the long-term excellence bank accounts are reflected in a firm's stock price. But economists haven't defended the strong form of the efficient markets hypothesis in a long time, probably not since Sanford Grossman and Joseph Stiglitz's 1980 paper on the impossibility of informationally efficient markets. And 1980 is, ironically, 1 year before Jack Welch became CEO of General Electric. The weak form of the efficient markets hypothesis is that firms reflect only the publicly available information, that first short-term performance bank account. The second long-term bank account is largely invisible to investors and most CEOs and senior managers. So, in a world of naive economic models based on perfect information, any shady dealing or short-term dealing by a CEO would be immediately punished with a drop in stock price. But in the real world, shady financial dealings by one CEO, Jack Welch, wasn't even known by his hand-picked successor, Jeffrey Immelt. And that's also why there's a lot of money to be made through insider trading, at least if you don't get caught. And so here's the fatal flaw of the Jack Welch School of Management. It's very easy to take money out of the long-term excellence bank account and put it into the short-term performance bank account. If someone were foolish enough to make me CEO of a Fortune 500 company, I could do it on my very first day. I would cut research and development, eliminate bonuses, lay off staff, replace senior programmers with junior programmers, and outsource IT and other departments to high-turnover shops based overseas. In the short term, my firm's costs will go way down and profits will go way up. And then in 4 years, my stock options will vest and I'll be set for life. But these measures will also drain the firm's long-term excellence bank account and cripple it for the long haul. And that's exactly what Welch and his disciples did. And although Welch seemed to have a pretty good run while he was head of GE, Welch's disciples did not do so well, and their outcome was a consistent track record of failure at a wide variety of firms like 3M, Fiat, and Home Depot. One of the few exceptions was Tom Tiller, who left GE to become CEO of a snowmobile company called Polaris. But Tiller explicitly rejected Welch's principles and ran Polaris as a high-trust family business. The most spectacular failure of a Welch disciple was Harry Stonecipher, and he managed to ruin not one, but two of America's greatest firms, McDonnell Douglas and Boeing. In his book Flying Blind, Peter Robison explains that Boeing was once the world's leader in aviation, and they had an engineering-based corporate culture that prized safety. So Boeing's big rival, McDonnell Douglas, brought in Stonecipher, and they hoped that Welch's cost-cutting ways would help them compete with their arch-rival. But instead, Stonecipher essentially ran the company into the ground. But he was able to arrange a buyout by Boeing that got him a powerful voting bloc on Boeing's board. And as some Boeing employees would put it, McDonnell Douglas bought Boeing with Boeing's money. So Stonecipher's voting bloc allowed him to ruin Boeing the exact same way that he ruined McDonnell Douglas. He began a number of cost-cutting strategies such as outsourcing design, manufacture, and computer programming. Programming jobs that were once done in-house by high-quality Boeing engineers were done by contractors from India making as little as $9 an hour. They also cut back on test pilot time and on pilot training. But the ultimate sign of Boeing's cost-cutting ways was that they chose to update their aging 737 plane into a new iteration called the 737 MAX. What they should have done was designed a brand new plane that could compete with the fuel-efficient Airbus A320. So for airlines, the more fuel-efficient a plane is, the cheaper the tickets that you sell are, and most passengers buy tickets strictly on price. So if you can get a more fuel-efficient plane, you're going to sell a lot more tickets. But Boeing did not develop a new plane. Instead, they created the 737 MAX. And it was so technologically out of date that it didn't even have an electronic checklist, which is something that Boeing's own engineers had pioneered 30 years earlier with planes like the 757 and the 767. But the main problem with the 737 was that it was designed back when airplane engines were a lot smaller. Modern engines are much more fuel efficient, but they're also much larger. And there was no good spot to put the much larger engines on the 737 plane, so they had to mount them relatively high up on the wing. And that was a major design compromise that made the plane more prone to stalling. To fix this potentially fatal flaw, Boeing created special anti-stall software for the plane. Now, planes are not supposed to need special software to prevent them from stalling. Normal planes have very clever engineering that causes the plane to passively stabilize. And that's a fun YouTube rabbit hole to go down. There's a lot of great aviation sites that will explain how that works. But because of this big design compromise, Boeing needed to use active stabilization. They needed this software to be monitoring the plane in real time and then stabilizing it, at least under unusual circumstances. And here's the crazy part. This software was attached to a single sensor with no redundancy. And yeah, you heard that correctly. No redundancy. Airbus uses triple redundancy, and the Space Shuttle uses 5 times redundancy, and Boeing used no redundancy whatsoever. If that single sensor was faulty, it would cause the plane to literally dive straight down into the ground as if on a suicide mission. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Twice. The only way to avoid a fatal crash in that situation is for the pilot to follow a fairly complicated troubleshooting procedure. And although it's complicated, a couple hours in the simulator would have been enough time to train the pilots what to do. And at this point in the story, I should mention one of Boeing's more tragic cost-cutting decisions. They outsourced the design of the 737 MAX's flight simulator to a firm that didn't even have an engineering staff when it was awarded the contract. Not surprisingly, it was late making the delivery, but Boeing used their lobbying clout to get the plane approved even though the simulator was not ready. And hold that thought about the lobbying clout, because when we get to government failure, we'll learn about the revolving door between people in industry and government regulators that allows them to create these kind of deals. And so the result was 2 fatal crashes of a brand new plane within the span of 5 months, and it killed 346 people. And here's where Boeing adds insult to injury. Because these crashes took place in the developing nations of Indonesia and Ethiopia, Boeing blamed pilot error rather than their own errors. They said that the people from these developing nations just didn't know how to fly planes very well. But everyone at Boeing knew the truth long before these fatal crashes happened. Internal emails and transcripts from group chats of Boeing employees showed that the engineers were designing a plane that they would never let their own families fly on. One employee colorfully said, "This airplane is designed by clowns who are in turn supervised by monkeys." And the final irony of all this is that outsourcing doesn't save money even in the short-term performance bank account. And this is where we start getting geeky and theoretical again. An internal document called Outsource Profits by a Boeing employee named John Hart Smith explained how outsourcing impoverished Boeing. And he covered a whole bunch of ways that this happened, so I'm only going to look at one of them. But you could probably find that document on Google. I did a couple years ago. It's probably still there. And here's the main way that outsourcing enriches the third-party vendors at the expense of the outsourcing firm. Whenever you outsource a part, you have to give that third-party vendor a detailed specification that that part must meet. And that gives the vendor an enormous amount of leverage if the part needs to be redesigned. They have a signed legal contract on their side, so the vendor can say, "Hey, you gave us a specification the part had to meet and we met it. If you want to go to court on this, that's fine with us. We'll drag it out for years while Airbus keeps selling more and more A320s, and ultimately we're going to win because we upheld our end of the deal to the letter." Now, firms like Boeing are not dumb. They know that this is a major problem, but the only way to avoid that problem is to spend a lot of time over-engineering the design of every single part that they outsource, and that's a slow and inefficient process. The reality is that the fastest way to design a part is through an iterative trial and error process. You come up with an original design, you test it, you modify the design, you test it some more, you modify it some more, you test it some more, and then you get the final part. But Boeing couldn't do that because they decided to outsource. So they spent a lot of time trying to think of what the specification should be without doing any testing. And that's really hard to do, and you're going to make mistakes, and there are going to be parts that need to be redesigned, particularly during the late-stage integration testing of an airline. And that's exactly what happened to Boeing. In the end, Boeing was forced to buy up all their third-party vendors at the staggering cost of $50 billion, all so that they could finally tell them to make a tiny change without having to spend years fighting a legal battle over it. So here's the kicker. Boeing originally decided against building a brand new cutting-edge plane that could have leapfrogged past the Airbus A320 because they didn't want to spend the $20 billion that it would have cost. Instead, they spent $50 billion on a plane that was worse than the A320. So if you want to know why short-term thinking is bad management, just look at the case of the Boeing 737 MAX. Bad firms treat everything like a number and operate in the world of formal contracts with terms that can be objectively measured. Good firms foster trust between senior management and rank-and-file employees and operate informally, maximizing the second long-term excellence bank account of a firm. And so what's the value of trust between senior management and rank-and-file employees? In the case of Boeing, about $50 billion. So, the Jack Welch theory of management is based on the libertarian philosophy that everything that happens in a firm can be reduced to a number that can be measured and easily tracked. Or, as economists would put it, that employees are governed by complete and costlessly enforced contracts. But that view is simply wrong, and it took another libertarian economist, Ronald Coase, to figure out why. And Coase asked, why do firms even exist? Instead of having 20,000 employees, why don't firms have literally 0 employees, and every single task is outsourced to a subcontractor? And Coase's insight is that the reason why firms exist is because of something called transaction costs. So yes, you can reduce everything to a number and you can create formal contracts around that number, but the cost of getting that information and then creating this formal and well-specified contract can actually be very, very high. In fact, sometimes it can be even higher than actually doing the thing in the first place. So paying an employee to do tasks X, Y, and Z might only cost you $50,000, but creating a specification for a formal contract to do X, Y, and Z, and then properly monitoring and enforcing that contract may cost $300,000. And if you've ever been in a meeting in the business world where people are debating the best approach for some problem that has emerged, and after an hour of this debate, you just get so frustrated you want to stand up and yell at everyone, for crying out loud, in the time that we've been talking about this, I could have just done it myself. So you get 10 people in a meeting all getting paid, say, $50 an hour to do something that you could have done in 20 minutes on your own. So that's an intuitive way to think about the problem of creating a well-defined specification and then enforcing that specification versus just doing the thing. But here's another way to think about it. If you consider most of your jobs, it probably takes you anywhere from 6 months to 3 years to truly get up to speed. You've got to learn all the various tasks that come up. You've got to learn a lot of domain-specific knowledge. You've got to learn the employees. You've got to learn who to talk to get things done. And once you know all that, you can be much faster and more efficient. But if you don't know that, you're going to be very slow and you're going to need a lot of help. So employees are not fungible and replaceable commodities. So Jack Welch and his protégés thought of themselves as alpha males who could make the tough decisions that weaker CEOs were unable to make. But the real legacy is that they were fearful and timid leaders. You can't dare greatly when your only guiding principle is fear of a short-term setback. So I'll take creators like Elon Musk and Steve Jobs and Satya Nadella over Jack Welch and his cronies every time. In a later video, we'll talk about Elinor Ostrom, and we'll start to begin to see how we can solve the problem where you've only got a single Nash equilibrium of always defect. But for now, I think the main lesson that comes from the failure of the Jack Welch School of Management is that firms need to go back to hiring internally from within their company. The CEO and senior manager should all be people drawn from the core business who have a strong subjective feel for that internal, ephemeral, impossible to measure long-term excellence bank account. So that wraps up this first video, which is focused on the practical side of running a firm. The next video is more theoretical. And if we step back, you can think that there's 3 types of solutions. The left is in favor of top-down solutions run by experts. Libertarians are in favor of economic incentives, and conservatives are in favor of culture. And in the case of firms, you can't use economic incentives. That's what the next video is going to be about. So firms have to succeed based on their culture, not on incentives.